Welcome back to my channel, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about my updated DSP calculations. These will apply to the Helix firmware 2.91, Helix native 1.91, and PodGo 1.10. First, we're going to do a little bit of show and tell of the document on my website. There will be a link down in the description for how you can get there. And after we do that, we're going to get super nerdy and brainiac, and I'm going to show off some of the methodology and talk about the calculations and how I figure all this stuff out and measure it. So that will be what we're going to look at today. I hope you're all going to dig it. Let's dig in. So when you go to my website, you'll see the menu across the top. On the Helix dropdown and the PodGo dropdown, on both of those, you'll see a link to DSP Allocations. So basically, you can click on that link, and it will bring you to this page. Now, the first thing we're going to do is talk about the effects. So let's just type into my search box, hide all amp models. There's no amp models that have that name, so they're all gone. That just lets me more conveniently scroll down to the effects here. When we look at the DSP costs, we have the traditional columns for the mono and the stereo costs, which you can select on Helix class devices to determine which block you're using, and of course the stereo blocks typically have a higher processing power than the mono blocks. We have one new column for the PodGo cost. Why don't we have two? Well, the PodGo has blocks either fixed as mono or fixed as stereo. For example, all delay blocks are in stereo, while all distortion blocks are in mono. So we don't need two columns, we only need one column. The next thing we're going to see is that when we look at the PodGo costs, they're typically going to be more than their corresponding Helix costs. Now, the reason for this is because I've considered the baseline of PodGo to be only the amount of processing power that you directly control. What does that mean? We take a look at PodGo edit here. We see every preset has a fixed wah block. You can't take that wah block out. It only uses a couple of % of processing power, but you can't take it out of there. So we don't have to consider its cost when we're building a preset. It's basically a free block that you don't have to worry about. Same thing with the volume block. You can change it from a volume pedal to a basic gain block or a pan block or stereo width block, but it doesn't matter what you do. You can't take it out of the preset. So it's essentially a free block. You don't have to worry about the amount of processing it costs. That goes accordingly for the amp block, the cab block, and the EQ block. All of these equalizers are considered free. They don't cost you anything to change to a different EQ block. You get it for free. We're going to talk more about the amp blocks when we start talking about amp DSP, but essentially, the reason all of the PodGo blocks are going to look like they cost more than Helix blocks is because I've calculated the percentages based on essentially these 4 empty blocks. So you only have to worry about the amount of horsepower you're assigning to the 4 new blocks. So looking at this list, you'll be able to compare all the DSP costs. There's some blocks that are not available in the PodGo. If I just trim down to things with NA in them, we look down here, we can pretty quickly find Cosmos Echo, Roland Space Echo, not in the PodGo. Why not? They announced that some of the blocks wouldn't be in there because they would just be too expensive. And if we look at this chart, we can kind of see what that means. On Helix, the stereo Cosmos Echo takes up 25% of the horsepower. Now, as we noted, they're all going to be higher on the PodGo based on the way I calculate them. So on the amount of DSP that you control on the PodGo, you could imagine that the Cosmos Echo, the Roland RE201, would essentially cost 30, maybe even 35 or 40% of your DSP. So with one block alone, you basically have eaten up almost half of your available power, which means you may not be able to add even a single other effect. And there may even be amps that you would not be able to use. So they've trimmed things like that out. And we'll see there's a couple of other blocks here, right here. These 3 distortion pedals, the Clawthorn drive, the Tone Sovereign, which is the king of tone, and the new legendary drive, also not available on PodGo. So when you see an NA, that just means those things don't exist on PodGo, so there's no measurement needed for them. So let's talk about speaker cabs next. Trim it down to just my speaker values here. It is pretty well established in the Helix community that the stock cabs are also based on impulse responses with a little bit of extra processing that allows you to control the distance of the microphone from the grill of the speaker and also to add early reflections on top of that impulse response. So when we talk about stock cabs versus IRs, what we're really talking about is Line 6's first-party impulse responses versus third-party add-on impulse responses. Insert small advertisement here. If you want to support my channel or my website or this kind of content, head over to the Line 6 Marketplace and check out my preset packs, which generally include some of my own custom impulse responses to help you get even more accurate and more awesome rock and roll. Yeah! But back to talking about DSP calculations. So when we look at the Helix, stock cab is 9.6%, while the third-party IR is 9.3% for a 1024. For a 2048 IR, we've got 17% versus a dual cab at 19%. Now, when we look at the Pod Go edit at our cab block, doesn't matter if you have a 212, a single 6x9, or an Ampeg 810, or any one of these other speaker models on here. You have to have this block, and these are all considered to be free and the baseline at 0% cost. If you switch over to an IR, you can use a 1024 IR, but if we look at our list here, we'll see that a stock cab is considered to have 0% cost on Pod Go Edit, while the third-party IR is considered to have a 3.2% cost on Pod Go. Now, this is a little bit different than the HX products where the third-party IR is the tiniest bit cheaper than the stock cabs, but on the Pod Go, for whatever reason, the IR costs a little bit more than the stock cabs, but it's only measured in terms of the expense over and above the fixed cost that you have to have a speaker block in there. So on Pod Go Edit, the IR is about 3% more than the stock cab. Another new thing that I've done here for this version is I've measured the looper. I forgot to measure the looper in every previous version of this document, I think. So I remembered to get in there and measure the looper this time. So we can see it doesn't matter whether you're using the 1-switch looper or the 6-switch looper, and it doesn't matter whether you're using it in stereo or in mono, the cost is the same. And of course, the same is true of the Pod Go. Now, let's talk about the amplifiers. We're gonna hide all the effects here, so we can just focus on the amplifiers, and I'll delete this search, which will bring all the amplifiers back up. When we start checking out the amps here, they are going to be a little bit different than previous versions of these measurements, where I used to measure the amp block versus the amp plus cab block. But really, what it was is the amp plus cab block was always about 10% more than the amp block alone, which makes sense because a stock cab costs about 10%. So I didn't see a lot of value in spending time measuring that, but what I did do now instead is I measure the preamp block versus the amp block with no cab. And the great thing about that is it can then apply to the Pod Go as well, where there is no amp plus cab block. We look at these numbers here then with that in mind, and we see here's the HX amp alone cost versus the HX amp with no cab cost, the Pod Go cost as a preamp, and the Pod Go cost as an amp with no cab. We look at these and you see something a little bit different than what we see with the effects, where on the effects, the Pod Go cost was generally more than the Helix cost, but when we look at the amps, the Pod Go cost is generally less than the Helix cost. There's a cool reason for that too. So let's look at a couple of examples here. We look at the Tweed Blues, which is the Fender Bassman amp. On the Helix, the preamp cost is 16%, while it's 12% on the Pod Go, but the amp block is about 31% on the Helix and a little less than 31% on the Pod Go. Now let's talk about why the effects are more expensive on Pod Go, while the amps are cheaper on Pod Go. Take a look at Pod Go Edit again here, And we noted that on a speaker block, all of these speakers cost the same. It doesn't matter which one you use. They all do essentially the same kind of processing, even though they do it with different numbers. The algorithm is identical no matter which cabinet you're using. On amps, that's not true. Every amp has a different cost from every other amp. That means as you adjust these amps, you're making more or less horsepower available for these other 4 assignable slots. Let's look back at our calculations. Let's sort and find the cheapest block on the Helix. So when we look at the amps, we see the cheapest amp block is the Dell Sol 300, the Sun Coliseum 300. We look at the cheapest preamp. The cheapest preamp is also the Sun Coliseum 300. So what I did when you look at the Pod Go is I effectively considered the Sun Coliseum preamp model to be 0%. So every amp's cost is just what it costs over and above that. So using a Sun Coliseum amp model as opposed to the preamp will cost you an additional 5% DSP power. Using the Pierce Channel 2 will cost you 3% more than using the Sun Coliseum. So that means when we look at HX Edit here, if I don't want to use this amp block because I'm doing an acoustic patch or something like that, I can deactivate it, switch it over to a preamp model, scroll down here to the bottom where we have the Sun Coliseum 300 and assign that, and that means I now have the maximum amount of DSP power available for other effects. And I can show you what that looks like in practice. We'll come over here to my user folder where I have a preset saved that already has full DSP. So when we look at my effects list here, you can see these are all grayed out. I have no horsepower to put anything else in this block. They're gone. It's completely used. So if I switch back over to the amp here, change it over to a preamp, and assign it to a Sun Coliseum, we look at this list now, lo and behold, every one of these categories is now lit up. I can assign any other effect that I want in here because I made a bunch of extra processing power available. So my pro tip for everybody out there is if you don't want to use the amp processing inside Pod Go and you just want to use it as a pedal board in front of an amp or use it as an acoustic rig, assign your amp model to a preamp of the Sun Coliseum and turn it off. Keep the speaker cab, not IR, keep it on speaker cab, and turn that off as well. So those are both deactivated. That'll give you the maximum amount of DSP power to assign whatever effects you want in all of the other slots. I promised at the top of the video that we were going to get super nerdy today, and now it's time to do that. So let's dig into HX Edit, and I will show you how I start to establish the baseline to get all of these calculations and talk a little bit about what that process is like. Let's dig in. The first thing I need to do is establish a baseline for every block and look for anchor points. So what I mean by that is I'm going to go one by one through every block in the Helix and see how many I can fit into a path. In order to start doing that, I've discovered you should always set the output level to the minimum so it's muted, because you can get some pretty gnarly sounds out of this thing when you start filling it up. But what I'll basically do is go into the Exotic EP booster and start duplicating it across the path. 4, 5, 6, 7, I'm just pasting copies, 8, make room, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So we look at my distortion category. I cannot fit another EP booster in there. So I know that 14 is the maximum number of EP boosters. Now I still have a bunch of processing power. I could put delays, modulations, EQs, stuff like that in there. But essentially what I would do is make a note. 14 EP boosters fit on a path with room to spare. And as I continue going down the list, let's minimize our path again. I would end up finding things like the heir apparent. So we'll go into distortion. The heir apparent is the Prince of Tone. So let's put that on there. And as I paste it, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, bring it down, 9, 10. When I go to paste again, I can't. And when I look at the list here, it's very interesting. There's no processing power left. Not even a volume or pan block can be placed on here. So that means this block is very close to using up exactly 100% of the DSP when you put 10 of them in the path. Let's do path 2 here and check out the stereo version of this block. If the stereo version costs exactly twice as much as the mono version, and it took 10 mono blocks to fill up, it should only take 5 stereo blocks to fill up. So let's go to my distortion, go back to the Prince of Tone, let's switch it over to stereo. So now I have a stereo version of the Prince of Tone. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I look here, again, I've perfectly used up the DSP, 100% of that chip. Remember, path 1 and path 2 are separate chips. There's 2 DSP chips in the Helix. They're both identical, so they both have the same amount of horsepower available on them. So path 1, we see 10 of these takes up exactly 100%, so 100 divided by 10 is 10%. So we know that a mono Prince of Tone is approximately, exactly, if that even makes sense, 10%. While a stereo Prince of Tone is nearly exactly 20% for each block. And as I am measuring every single one of these blocks, I would just note down which blocks are perfect. And I come up with a list like the heir apparent in mono is exactly 10%, the heir apparent in stereo is exactly 20%, the MPEG scrambler, exactly 6 blocks will fill up a path. So I do the math, 100 divided by 6 is 16.7%. So I know that the scrambler is about 16.7%. Things like the dark glass, Obsidian 7000, that's where things start to get a little bit more interesting. So let's take a look at what that one looks like. Let's go here. Remember to minimize our output, and we're going to look at distortion. Dark glass electronics, microtubes B7000 Ultra. So that's the Obsidian 7000 model on Helix. We'll put that in stereo. And I'm basically going to copy that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now when I look here, it almost used it up perfectly, but you can still have a volume block on there. So let's add the volume block. You can add another volume block. Let's put on another one. Now we can't add a third volume block. So 5 of these is almost perfect. But when we look, we can still add volume blocks to it. Now volume blocks are going to be the cheapest thing you can have in Helix. So we add 2 volume blocks. And this is where we start to have to do a little bit of estimation and a little bit of calculation and verification as we move further down the line. So what I started out doing at the beginning of the process is assuming that a volume block probably used around 0.5% of processing power. Now I could be wrong with that assumption. It could be too high, it might use less than 0.5%, or it could be too low, it might use more than 0.5%. But it's going to be real close to that is what I figured just based on my knowledge of DSP programming and algorithms. So as I make that assumption, if a volume block is worth about 0.5%, that means being able to add 2 of them, these 5 instances of the Obsidian model must add up to 99% rather than adding up to 100%. So 99 divided by 5, and I see that the dark glass model is going to be about 19.8% in cost. And if we look at my list, let's get rid of the amps here and look for the dark glass, we'll see I've calculated 19.8%. I noted that I could be a little bit inaccurate. Maybe these things are a little cheaper than 0.5%, maybe they're a little more. Through trial and error of doing the rest of the calculations, I'll be able to figure that out. We can also talk about how we would measure a much cheaper block. So when we look at something like a wah pedal, you see all the wah pedals use 1.7% for the cheaper ones and 3.8% for the 2 more expensive ones, and they all use 3.9%, about 4%, for the stereo versions. So let's take a look at the teardrop, the Dunlop Crybaby Facel 310, and figure out how we would measure that. How did I come up with 3.8% for that? If we look at 3.8 times 16, which is the maximum amount of blocks you can put on one path, see that only comes up to 61%. So even if I went into my HX edit and I just assigned 16 wah blocks to this, I still have 40% of processing available. What I try to do for that is put in some other known blocks. So again, I mentioned this is all trial and error, so it takes a lot of different mixing blocks in and out to figure this out. But we could do something like take the legacy drive in stereo, that's the Carvin VLD1, and I can put 2 of those in there. Now putting 2 of those in there, we look at our list here, legacy, 41.3% for a stereo legacy drive. So I've already used 84% of my processing power just by putting those 2 blocks on there. Next thing I can do is add in my wah blocks and see how much they take. So let's go to the wah, take the Facel 310, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I can't paste in another one of those. I hit the paste, nothing happens. We look at our wah category, we see we cannot fit another Dunlop Crybaby Facel in there. We do have available all these other wah models that we could add. We can of course add volume and pan. We can add a couple of different modulation models, 1 EQ, some dynamics. So essentially what I'll do from here is try to figure out what is the most expensive thing I could add in here. As I look at this list, I essentially have to cross-reference with my notes of other things that I've already calculated. If we look at the hard gate, it's using 1.5% of processing power. If I look at the simple EQ, it's using 1.7%, so it's even a better category to have there. If I look at the tremolo, we're looking at the regular tremolo block, it's 1.9%. That's even more, so let's go there. Let's look at the Goat Keeper. Goat Keeper is 1.36 for the legacy version, 1.6 for the modern version. So the tremolo block was the most expensive block that I found that I could put in here. So let's keep the tremolo block in. So now I know I've used 41.33, 41.33, 1.9, 1.93, and 4 other blocks. So what I can do now is take 41.33 plus 41.33 plus 1.93. So I've used 84.6% of my DSP power with those. Let's subtract those from 100, which means I had left for those 4 wah pedals 15.4%. So let's divide that by 4. and we'll see we get 3.8%, which is what each of these blocks would approximately cost. So we take a look here back at the cell, and we see that we came up with 3.8% as my cost. Now I know that my calculation said 3.85%, where I actually measured it out to 3.8%, and that would just be slight margin of error due to when I actually did the measurements, I may have used slightly different blocks than what I did here. But this is also why I always tell people my calculations are only accurate to within about 1%, maybe plus or minus 0.5% or plus or minus 1%. But it's accurate enough that you can get a really good picture of how much things cost. I know that I'm showing everything out to 2 decimal places of accuracy, but let's use the term accuracy loosely. So really plus or minus 1% is probably about where you should consider it, but they're all going to be really, really close. That's all I have for you today. I hope everyone has enjoyed it. Thanks for sticking with me this long. If you enjoy my channel, you like seeing more of this content, you want to encourage me, the best way to do that is to head over to my website, check out all my preset packs I have for sale. Consider supporting me by making a purchase there. I hope you get some good presets that you can enjoy, but certainly I always enjoy those contributions. That's my form of donations. Rather than you just throwing pennies at me, hopefully you can also get a little bit of use out of supporting me as well. Anyway, I'm thankful for all of you, all of my viewers, all of my supporters. Thank you for all the kind words you leave me on the Facebook portals and in the comments down below. And I will see you all in the next video.